All right, we're going to pick up with 1 Samuel 16, and we're going to go through it as we have been doing with chapter 15. These two chapters, of course, go together. The rejection of Saul and then the selection of David come right after. The selection of David comes right after the rejection of Saul. So we'll look at that chapter, and then we're going to move on and look rather quickly at some of the themes. I've touched on some of these already, but I want to, highlight some things, some other things in Samuel, and then hopefully I'll leave a little bit of time at the end to get started on Kings before the day ends. But Samuel, I think you were next for reading. Could you read the first 13 verses of chapter 16? Okay, thank you. The last part of chapter 15, Samuel was mourning over Saul, grieved for Saul, and then again, chapter divisions are not in the original text. The immediate thing that happens after is the Lord sends him off to Jesse's house. There's clearly been some passage of time, but Samuel's now being sent to select and anoint the successor to Saul. A couple of questions I want to raise on this. One is, any thoughts on the way that Jesse, or the narrative of how David comes to Samuel's attention? So you have Jesse presenting different sons before he gets to David. Any thoughts or observations on what might be going on there? Yeah, right. Yeah, let me pursue that a little bit. So he's out with the sheep, taking care of the sheep, which, you think that's a menial task. The next chapter he's going to go is the Goliath story, and his brothers are already out of the battle. Okay, why would that be? Why is David not out there with his brothers when Goliath is taunting? He does eventually go out there, but he's going out there to bring food. He's not going out to fight. Yeah. So the oldest brother looks like a king. Who else looked like a king? Really tall. Okay. So Samuel still has to learn the outward appearance of being kingly doesn't necessarily make you a good king, right? That reiteration of the lesson that he should have gotten from Saul. But the reason why, the technical reason why David's not out with his brothers in the battle, because he's too young. You have to be 20 to be part of the army, and he's still a teenager. So he's delivering messages and food, but he's not yet old enough to be there. He's also, Samuel was pointing to this, but you have this pattern in Scripture of the firstborn overlooked in favor of a younger son, and sometimes the youngest is the one who's elevated above his brothers. Yeah, Joseph is another one. Another example of a younger brother who is eventually elevated. One very precise parallel or very precise suggestion. Notice how many brothers are presented to Samuel. Eliab, Abinadab, Shammah, those are the three named ones. And then, I don't think it means 7 more of his sons, but all 7 of the sons that are home pass before Samuel. But only 3 are named, and then the 4th one that's named is David. So David is the 8th son. Okay, that ranking in the family is significant, I think. But he's the 4th one named. I think there's a link here to, if you go back to Genesis, who's the oldest son of Jacob? Reuben. Who are the next 2? Simeon and Levi. Why aren't they leading Israel? Yeah, okay, with his father's concubine, right. And
They're not from the wife that God has. He didn't bear
You're saying from the right mother? Is that what you're saying? No, these are all daughters of, all sons of Leah. Shechem. It's the Shechem story, right? It's when Simeon and Levi are the ones who lead the assault on Shechem and kill all the Shechemites. So those three are disqualified. Who's the fourth son? Judah, right. So you have that three sons who are overlooked and disqualified from being the first, treated as the firstborn, who's Judah. You have a small scale, three named sons overlooked in favor of the fourth named son, who is David. He's the true Judah. He's the true Judahite. He's going to be the king. The eighth son, I think that's also significant. We've talked about sevens a few times. Seven is the week. The eighth day is the beginning of a new week. It's the day after the Sabbath. Like the day of resurrection, Jesus is raised on the day after the Sabbath. And in John, that's described as the eighth day on a couple of occasions. The eighth day has to do with new creation and new life. And the eighth son, I think, is representing something similar here. So you've got these seven sons pass, but the eighth son is going to be one who's is a kind of new, representing a new world, a new phase of Israel's history. One other thing, I want to go back to the shepherding thing. So shepherding is a menial task. We might think about that. How does David think about his activities as shepherd? Does he think they disqualify him to fight Goliath? So the shepherding is actually, training for battle with Goliath, training for his role as the shepherd of Israel, which is what he's called in the Psalms. He guides Israel like a flock, and he's going to fight off human lions and bears that attack Israel the same way he fought off actual lions and bears as a shepherd. So in some sense, it's a menial task for the youngest brother, but at the same time, it's preparing him for the battles that he's going to fight as king. All right, we have the reference to the Spirit of the Lord coming on him. Think back again to the book of Judges. The Spirit equips the judges. The Spirit equips them particularly with the energy and the prowess to fight the Lord's battles. That's what the Lord has done for Saul. And now that same Spirit, the Spirit of war, the Spirit of battle, is coming on David. And then, Emmanuel, could you read the rest of chapter 16, please? Okay, thank you. So we have this verses 13 and 14. The Spirit of the Lord comes on David, and at the same time is departing from Saul, leaving Saul bereft of the power and gifts that he needs to continue to be king. And instead, he's plagued by an evil spirit that the Lord sends him as a discipline, and that evil spirit terrorizes him. Okay. David comes into contact with Saul because he's a skillful musician, and music is what Saul asks for to defend him against the evil spirit and to relieve him when the evil spirit comes on him. Okay. This is a kind of spiritual war that David is carrying out by music against the spirit that terrorizes Saul. And it's an interesting contrast with the next chapter when David's going to confront Goliath. He's outmatched by Goliath. Goliath has armor, a huge spear, a sword, and a shield. David has no armor, stones, and a sling. So he's outmatched. But he can still physically battle Goliath. But the evil spirit is not capable of fighting off the evil spirit and subduing the evil spirit with those physical weapons, the physical weapon of a sling and a stone. But he uses music instead. Music has a power to overcome evil spirits. It's kind of it's associated, I think, with Jesus said certain kinds of demons come out only by prayer and fasting. And I think we have a similar kind of vision here of David's music and song expels the spirits. Any thoughts about that particular observation or anything else in the last part of that chapter? Yeah.
Question. The servant that recommends David.
Yeah.
He says David was a man of war.
Oh. Yeah. Yeah. He says he's a valiant, a man of valor, a warrior. He does say he's a warrior, prudent in speech, a handsome man. There is some question about how these incidents fit together. One of the puzzles is the fact that at the end of chapter 17, after David has won the battle over Goliath, Saul asks whose son this is, as if he doesn't know David. So it might be that this is arranged not in the order of events, but in some thematic way, to set up David as musician with power over evil spirits before it shows him as a warrior. The fact that he's explicitly called a warrior. That's an odd thing to say if he's never actually, if he is, as I said, in chapter 17, he is too young to be at the battle. So it may be that these are out of chronological order. Okay, and so that would, if that's the case, then David's victory over Goliath comes first. Saul asks who he is, and then later David comes into Saul's house as his armor bearer and his musician. I think it's interesting that what looks like the slightly more powerful weapon of a sling and a stone is actually impotent. It's a weapon that can't work against Saul's enemies. Saul's enemy is an evil spirit, and David can't use physical weapons, so he has to use a spiritual weapon of music. And I think that also gives us a way of thinking about what we're doing when we're singing and praising the Lord and playing music to the Lord. It is praise to God. It's an act of worship. It has an emotional dimension to it, properly so. It puts us in the right frame of mind of joy or lament, whatever the case may be. But this passage suggests that music also has a kind of spiritual power to drive it. Satan doesn't like to hear people sing, apparently. I think that music has a way of directing our souls and forming our souls. I think we greatly underestimate the power of music. And it has tremendous effect on our moods and emotions. I mean, we know this kind of superficially, but I think it really does form us in deep ways. And a steady diet of certain kinds of music, and I mean, there are professional musicians who are more or less openly satanic in their orientation or their they might not be openly Satanists, but they have this kind of dabbling in the occult, dabbling in demonic activity. I think the music has power to shape our souls in that way. So I think we need to be very, very careful and fill our souls and our hearts with music that is directed to praising God and fills our souls with the right kind of shapes our souls in the right kind of directions. I mean, just think of the certain kinds of really heavy rock music that are, the music is just angry and I guess angry is the best description that I can give to it. If you have a steady diet of that kind of music, your soul is being shaped in a particular way. And especially if you don't have any counter to that, I think there's tremendous power in music in both directions. Right? Yeah, right. Yeah, I guess in a different sort of way, right? So Satan is given permission. God gives Satan permission to destroy Job's life, right? It doesn't oppress him in the way it seems to be oppressing Saul, psychologically or spiritually. I mean, Judas would be maybe the other example. Satan enters Judas and fills him before Judas betrays him. But it doesn't explicitly say that the Lord. It says Satan filled Judas. It doesn't say the Lord sent him. So I'm not thinking of any other examples that say exactly what this passage says about some other individual. Okay. So let me read a few verses of chapter 17 just to close this out and make a couple other points about David's career. Now the Philistines gathered the armies for battle. They were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They camped between Soko and Azekah, in Ephes Damim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. Philistines stood on the mountain on one side while Israel stood on the mountain on the other with the valley between them. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. A cubit is about 1.5 feet. Cubit is from the elbow to the tips of fingers. That's the measure. 6 cubits and a span. Span would be a handbreadth. The sideways of hand. 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed with scale, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had bronze greaves on his legs, a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. The head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him, and he comes out and defies the armies of Israel. Okay. A giant from Philistia. And he's asking for an Israelite to come out as a champion of Israel. The obvious choice is who should go out and face Goliath? Saul. After all, he's a head taller than anyone in Israel. He's an Israelite giant, not as tall as Goliath. But he is the king of Israel. If there's going to be a one-on-one battle between a Philistine hero and an Israelite hero, it should be Saul who's out there doing that. Right? But the Israelite giant is back in his tent. He, along with all those who hear Goliath, are dismayed and greatly afraid. Verse 11. Okay. This is not the Saul that started at the start of his career, who was filled with the Spirit and went out and fought against Nachash, the serpent king of the Ammonites. Okay. He went out and he heard about it, and he was outraged about the threat from the Ammonites, and he gathered an army, and he went immediately and delivered Jabesh-Gilead. But the Spirit of God has left him, and an evil spirit is tormenting him. And one of the effects of that is that instead of being a bold warrior, he's fearful and cowering in his tent when he should be out on the battlefield. Goliath is encased in metal. He's got metal on it's apparently a metal on every part of him. He is clothed with scale, verse 5. My translation says scale armor, but the word armor is not in the Hebrew. It just says he's clothed with scales. The kind of scales that a serpent might have. Goliath is like another serpent figure, like Nachash. Saul's first battle was against a serpent king. David's first battle is going to be against this Philistine giant who is dressed like a serpent. And Saul defeats his serpent. David's going to defeat this serpent and do it by crushing his head. Okay. The way you're supposed to defeat serpents. You're supposed to crush the head of the serpent and then cut off his head for good measure. Goliath is encased in armor, as I said, bronze helmets, scale armor, bronze greaves on his legs, a bronze javelin. So his legs are covered, his torso is covered, his head is covered in bronze. Just comes chomping out like a man made of metal. And then a stone hits him and he falls. Remind anybody of anything elsewhere in the Bible? A metallic figure that's struck by a stone and falls down. Yeah.
Dream.
Yes. Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2. Very good. Nebuchadnezzar dreams of this giant statue. It's made of 4 different metals. And while he's dreaming, a stone cut without hands crushes, hits it at the feet, and the whole thing falls to powder. That stone is representing the kingdom of God. It's a new Davidic king coming, represented by the stone that hits the metal figure. It's a metal figure of a man. It's not just it's a metal man, great big statue. And the new David is going to crush that statue the way the old David, the first David, crushed and defeated Goliath. Goliath has a spear in his hand. I think I mentioned the spear. Keep your eye on Saul's spear. Goliath has a spear. David comes out, and Goliath is going to. He's armed with a spear in order to direct it at David. The next time we see somebody with a spear, it's not a Philistine giant, it's the Israelite giant, Saul. And what's he doing with the spear? Yeah, he's flinging at David, right? He's become like a Goliath, right? He's kind of taken the side of Goliath as an opponent of the Lord's anointed prince. So you have this interesting parallel that develops between Goliath and Saul, and the struggle of David in the latter half of 1 Samuel. He cleans up Goliath, the Philistine giant, in one battle. That's comparatively simple. What does he do about the Israelite giant, who also has a spear? He can't crush the head of this enemy in the way he crushed the head of Goliath, because right now, Saul is the Lord's anointed, and David is not going to stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed. He has to figure out a way to evade Saul's attacks, to try to escape, to serve Saul while preserving his own life, while preparing himself for kingship that he knows will be his. This is a very complex kind of situation he's in, much more complex than trying to face down an opponent on the battlefield. Trying to be righteous and faithful to an oppressive superior. Not undermining or subverting the oppressive superior. Not seizing the kingdom. Okay. David is patient. David has opportunities. I talked about this already. He has not only the opportunity in the cave, but a couple chapters later, Saul's sleeping in his camp, and apparently all of Saul's guards are also asleep because David sneaks into the camp and he takes Saul's spear and a couple other things. Saul's spear, which is beside Saul's head, and he goes out of the camp and then reveals himself to Saul. Says, "Look, I'm a better guardian than you are, than your guardians are. You got Abner down there in the camp, and he can't keep me from getting into the camp. I preserved your life, though. I preserved your life better than Abner did." David is a better guardian of Saul than Saul's own soldiers. Well, David is one of his soldiers, but he's estranged, and Saul's trying to kill him. So this is a very complex situation that David is in, and he's a model of faithfulness in that situation. In 1 Samuel, David is a model of faithful subordination to an oppressive, evil superior. He survives. Got to survive if you want to become king. He fights for Saul even when Saul's trying to kill him. He escapes from Saul. He makes all kinds of maneuvers in order to survive and eventually inherit the kingdom. All the while waiting for the Lord to give him the kingdom. He's not like Adam. He's not going to seize the kingdom. He's not going to take the forbidden fruit. He's going to wait until the Lord gives it to him. The other thing he has to fight is the reputation of being an insubordinate to Saul. You might remember the story in 1 Samuel 25 of Nabal. Anybody remember what Nabal's name means? Fool. Nabal is a great property owner, and David asks him for help, and Nabal refuses. So David gets some of his soldiers, and he's going to go and he's going to destroy Nabal's house and kill Nabal until Abigail, Nabal's wife, comes out and intercedes. Right? And Nabal dies the next morning. So the Lord eliminates Nabal, and David takes Abigail as his wife. Although Abigail makes a good wife, he's already got a wife or two, so he probably shouldn't take another one. He shouldn't take another one, not probably. But the reason why Nabal refuses to help is because, look at this ruffian. David has a reputation of being somebody who's just an outlaw, on the run from Saul. He's got to be in the wrong because Saul's the king and Saul doesn't like him. Saul's trying to stop him. David's got to be a bad character. And look at all the people who have attracted to David. David attracts all the riffraff. Is that a familiar phrase, riffraff? All the outlaws, all the people who are oppressed by Saul's taxes, people who have had their property confiscated by Saul. They've just had enough, and so they leave the land and they go gather to Ziklag, where David is. And so that's another thing that David has to deal with. He's got to deal with the reputation that he's been plotting against Saul, which he's not doing, but that's what people think. That's what Nabal thinks and other people think. So when he becomes king, he's got to prove that he inherited the kingdom without stretching out a hand against Saul. And he does that largely by the way he honors Saul. I talked about the poem at the center of the book, David's Lament for Saul. That's a public lament. He shows that he honors Saul in his death. He doesn't speak ill of Saul. He never did speak ill of Saul. But he does that publicly so people can see, I heard that David was trying to get rid of Saul, but now here he is lamenting Saul. When Joab kills Abner, Abner is a Benjamite. He's the commander of Saul's army. And when Joab, one of David's soldiers, one of his commanders, kills Abner, David laments for Abner and leads the funeral procession. Again, a public expression that he's washing his hands. This was not my doing. He's trying to publicly overcome the reputation that he had overthrown Saul. Even well into his reign, you might remember Shimei. Remember Shimei? A Benjamite, so part of Saul's tribe. When David is running from Absalom, leaving the land, Shimei throws dust at him and curses David. And he says, "Served you right for overthrowing the Benjamite king." Okay, so that's well into David's reign when that's happening. That's toward the end of David's reign when that's happening. So there's still people, particularly in the tribe of Benjamin, that think that David is an illegitimate ruler, that he seized the kingdom. So that's another of the challenges that David has. He has to survive. He has to parry the attacks of Saul. He has to serve Saul faithfully as best he can. He has to wait for the Lord to give him the kingdom. He has to overcome this reputation of being a rebel. Okay. So the ascent of David to kingship is worth meditating upon as you're thinking. If I were preaching on that part of Samuel, I would be thinking about urging people to think about situations in their life where they are in positions of subordination to people who abuse them. How do you handle that? How do you faithfully handle that? Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember now if he's ever designated as one. I don't remember. There are other giants that David and his men fight. I don't remember if they're ever identified as Nephilim. I'd have to check that.
Even when the Israelites
Come to the land.
yeah,
Yeah.
to the land,
Yeah.
there were lots of Nephilim.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Israel is always fighting giants. Correct. And they are supposed to be, and often are, a nation of giant killers. The giants are still in the land when Joshua goes in. The initial spies that go in are afraid of the giants, but Joshua isn't afraid of the giants, even though they're still there. And then David is a giant killer. His mighty men are giant killers. That'd be something to preach too, you know. Yeah. Well, I think, Goliath, you're right, as we're given his dimensions, so we know he's a really big guy. And then I think there are some others that are described in similar, I don't know if the heights are given, but they're described as giants. Nephilim in Genesis 6, I think, are harder to pinpoint exactly what they are. I don't think that I said I wasn't going to talk about this, but I don't think it's angelic human unions in Genesis 6. I don't think that's possible. I think it's the sons of God are the faithful descendants of Seth. The daughters of men are the descendants of Cain. And the problem is that, to put it in New Testament terms, the believers are marrying unbelievers and are being corrupted by it. And that's what leads to the situation with the flood. There aren't any faithful descendants of Seth anymore. And the whole world is full of violence. And the Nephilim are products of that union, they do seem to be, they are giants in numbers. So, but giant could also mean something like warrior, or even somebody like a renowned person, that not necessarily physically a giant. So I think it would somewhat depend on the context of what exactly the terms mean. Okay. So where was I? I've been talking about, the point I was making was one of the practical things you can draw if you're preaching on Samuel, and especially the life of David before his kingship, would be to emphasize that his shrewdness, his courage in dealing with somebody he has to both respect and also to, in some sense, oppose. And we're often in situations like that, right? We're often in situations where we've got a boss who doesn't appreciate us, who abuses us, and we have to show proper respect. We need to serve them as best we can. We overcome evil with good, as Paul says. That's what David is doing. David is acting according to the commandments of Jesus and Paul in his relationship to Saul. Of course, David doesn't remain entirely faithful after he becomes king. He sins with Bathsheba and tries to cover it up with the murder of Uriah, her husband. I won't take time to go through that passage, but just to make a couple of points. The aftermath of that, David survives. God doesn't take away the kingdom from David because David repents. I think that's the key thing. As soon as Nathan says, "You are the man," he confesses. Nothing like, "Well, she was naked on the roof. It's her fault." Doesn't do that. That would be a Saul response. That'd be an Adam response. No. "You are the man," and David repents. He survives. His dynasty survives. But the remainder of his life is one disaster after another, many of them taking place in his own household. Amnon, one of his sons, rapes Tamar, one of his daughters. Absalom, another of his sons, kills Amnon for raping Tamar. Okay. And then Absalom tries to take over the kingdom and does take over the kingdom. So David loses the kingdom for a time, has to go out of the land, is eventually restored, but I will point to this. He's restored. Well, first of all, David doesn't do much of anything. I think I mentioned this already. David doesn't do much of anything. Amnon rapes Tamar. David does nothing to Amnon. Okay. Absalom kills Amnon, brother killing brother. David exiles Absalom for a time, but then lets him back home. Okay. When Absalom rebels, David flees, and he wants Joab to try to preserve Absalom's life, which Joab doesn't do. Joab kills him. But David is a very passive figure in the latter part of 2 Samuel. And I think it's the aftermath, the personal aftermath of the sin with Bathsheba. It's not just that his house is in turmoil, but he has lost the moral authority to rule his own kingdom and to rule his own house. He does not restrain his sons or he doesn't actually fight against his enemies. One sign of this, one really subtle sign of this, is after Absalom's rebellion, there's another rebellion by a Benjamite named Sheba. This is in 2 Samuel 20. David's commander Joab, Sheba. And then at the end of 2 Samuel 20, we have a summary of the administration of the kingdom. There's been an earlier summary of the chief officials in David's kingdom, but here's another one after the rebellion of Absalom, after the rebellion of Sheba. This is 2 Samuel 20:23. Joab was over the whole army of Israel. Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. Adoram was over the forced labor. Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud was the recorder. Sheva was scribe. Zadok and Abiathar were priests, and Ira the Gyrite was also a priest to David. Okay. That is the administration of David. Those are the administrators of David's kingdom. What's missing in that list? What's that? Joab is listed first. If you were listing the officials who were in charge of David's kingdom, who would you start with? David. Right. If you look at the other list, David's listed first. David is administering justice and righteousness, and then it has Joab and so and so and so and so, all the other. David's kind of disappeared from his own kingdom. After the rebellion of Sheba, it's almost as if Joab has conducted a coup, and Joab the army commander is the real one who's really in charge. David's still king, but there's a subtle hint that Joab has become the power behind the throne, and David has become just a hollow crown, to use the Shakespearean phrase, a hollow crown. There's nothing there, and it's because of his sin, I think, with Bathsheba and with Uriah, and it never says that the spirit departs from him as it did from Saul, but he becomes a very passive ruler, and again, a very preachable kind of sequence. Let me take just a few minutes. We'll take a break, but let me take a few minutes to go over quickly the things that I have under the heading of the theology of 1 and 2 Samuel. And then after the break, we'll begin with Kings. If you have your notes in front of you, this is Roman numeral 5. The central theological innovation, the central theological point of the Davidic of 1 and 2 Samuel is contained in 2 Samuel 7, which is the parallel in 1 Chronicles 17. This is the account of the Lord making a covenant with David. And he promises him a permanent kingdom. His son will sit on his throne. He will have an eternal kingdom. He promises that he will be heir of promises that were given to Abraham. The promises that are given to Abraham and to all the people are now focused on the king. And the success and faithfulness of the king is what will determine the blessing and whether Israel fulfills its mission or not. That all now depends on the king. It's all focused down. It's also the other element, the key element, I think, of the Davidic Covenant is when the Lord says to David, your son will be king after you, and he will be a son to me. Yahweh says this. That's the title. A son to me. The Davidic king is not only a son of David, but the Davidic king is a son of Yahweh. He's a son of God. What does that mean? Well, who is the son of God prior to this Davidic arrangement? Israel, exactly. Israel is my son, Moses says. Let my son go. That's Moses' message to Pharaoh. Israel is the corporate son. And now, David's son is the son of God. That means David's son, the king, is the embodiment of Israel. And Israel's future depends on what this Son of God, this individual king, does. And that's true throughout the history of the book of Kings. The rise and fall of the kingdom depends on what the king does. But it's also true, ultimately, of course, of the greater Son of David. The whole future of Israel, the whole future of God's program for humanity depends on the faithful Son of David, who is the faithful Israel, whose name is Jesus. Okay. So the Davidic Covenant is a kind of preparatory covenant. It establishes the terms that are relevant to Jesus' accomplishment of our redemption and the accomplishment of God's purposes. Because the Davidic Covenant, it was what brings all of the promises of God to Israel, to Abraham and to Israel, focused down on a single person. And Jesus comes as the Son of David. He comes as the true Israel. He is a faithful king, and because he's the truly faithful king, the absolutely faithful king, his kingdom is established forever, and all the purposes of God are going to be fulfilled through him. Okay. So the Davidic covenant is crucial not just for the theology of 1st and 2nd Samuel and Kings, but also for understanding what Jesus is about. How can Jesus, a single man, a single son of David, how can he bring redemption to the whole people? Well, it's because God has arranged things ahead of time to bring all of this into focus in one person, in the king. And we see that that's in 2 Samuel 7. We see that idea that David is the embodiment of Israel narratively all the way through 1st and 2nd Samuel. And on your notes, I have a couple of charts. They don't really look like charts. They look like parallel lists, but they're intended to be kind of charts. The first one is showing how David follows the life of Jacob. David's life is following the life of Jacob, whose other name is Israel. So David is a new Israel in that sense. Probably the most striking, I won't read it for the sake of time, but look at, if you want to look at 1 Samuel 19 at some point. This is when Saul is pursuing David. David is trying to get away from him. He pretends to be sick, puts the teraphim next to or in the bed. Michal, his wife, says he's sick. He can't come out. Saul's men go in there and find out that David has escaped through a window and gotten away. That's, in all kinds of particulars, that's a repetition of Jacob's escape from Laban's house. Jacob's wife, Rachel, has teraphim with her, household gods. She deceives her father as Michal deceives Saul. This enables Jacob to escape as David escapes and so on. So if you look at my commentary, Son to Me, this is just one snippet of what I show there. There are, all the way through 1 Samuel, there's a running narrative parallel between the life of Jacob and the life of David. The other side of this is that David is repeating the history of Israel. So he's repeating the history of Jacob, the original Israel, the man Israel, and he's also repeating the history of the nation Israel. And we already talked about this a bit, the end of 1 Samuel, where David is in Philistia. It's like an Egyptian exile. He comes out of exile back into the land. Along the way, he has to fight Amalekites, as Israel did. He comes into the land and conquers it and becomes the king. He brings the ark into Jerusalem. He's following the history of Israel in the Exodus and so on. Okay, so I think that narrative, those narrative parallels, are there to fill out the picture and the Davidic covenant that identifies David and David's sons with Israel as God's son. Another point I have there is fathers and sons. I've already talked about this a bit, but I just reiterate the fact that everybody in Samuel has unfaithful sons. Samuel's sons don't follow Samuel's lead. David's sons are an absolute mess. Eli's sons despise the Lord, and the Lord gets rid of them. Except Saul. Saul's got a great son Jonathan, the best son you can imagine. One of the character who is, in a sense, the most grievously failed character in Samuel is the one that ends up with this incredibly faithful son. It's quite a remarkable phenomenon. It's testimony to God's grace. In spite of Saul's sins, Saul somehow produces a son who's faithful. I think this also is it's a continuous problem for Israel, the problem of generational succession. Israel comes out of Egypt, and they fall in the wilderness. Israel conquers the land, and then the next generations don't continue the conquest, and we have the period of the judges. We have kings who are faithful, and their sons are unfaithful. Maintaining faithfulness over generations, that's very rare in the Old Testament. Very rare in the Old Testament. I think it's one of the things that the prophets, especially Malachi, promises that the new covenant will overcome. The Lord will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. It certainly doesn't happen perfectly in the history of the church, but there is a promise, I think, of generational faithfulness. Most of the illustrations, most of the examples we have in the Old Testament are bad ones. Okay, the last thing, a few comments about politics. We talked about the custom of the king in 1 Samuel 8, the king who takes, confiscates. When you have a moment, look at the end of 1 Samuel 31. David has fought the Amalekites. He's recovered all the stuff that was stolen from the Amalekites. And he's also recovered stuff that was confiscated from Israelite towns by the Amalekites and by other nations. And as he's becoming king, as in the same time that Saul is going to battle and he's going to die on Mount Gilboa, David is distributing this booty to the towns of Judah and Israel. Okay. That's a political act. He's restoring stuff that's been taken from them. So it's an act of restitution and justice. He's also winning friends, obviously. This is an important aspect of rule, not to turn gift giving and generosity into a mechanism to get people to follow you. But generosity is a path to authority and prestige. That's how politics works anthropologists tell us this is how political systems work in tribal societies. Yeah, like you don't have money passing from hand to hand in the United States government. Of course, doing favors for people, that's how you get and maintain power. David's doing it, I think, out of a generous spirit, but it's part of the establishment of his power. Another point about David and Joab. Joab is a murderer. Joab kills Abner. Joab kills Absalom after David has given him orders not to. When Shebna rebels at the end of 2 Samuel, David appoints Amasa as the commander because he doesn't want Joab to be commander anymore because he killed Absalom. Joab doesn't like being replaced, so he kills Amasa and takes over the army again. It's part of the coup at the end of, in 2 Samuel 20. Okay. Joab kills many people. David never gets rid of him. David never does anything to restrain him. That's part of the same theme that I was talking about earlier, that David doesn't restrain his own sons. There's a couple other wrinkles here. One of them is a kinship relationship. Joab is son of David's sister, Zeruiah. Nephew, Joab. I can't get rid of my nephew. He's part of the family. Yeah, he kills people occasionally, but he's part of the family. Okay. There's a hint, there's an implied warning about allowing these kin relationships to interfere with restraint and proper justice and rule. Why else would David be reluctant to do anything about Joab? Can you think of any other? What other source of power might Joab have over David? I'll ask more specifically. What does Joab know? Yes. Joab knows that David plotted to kill Uriah. Because David sends a message to Joab during the siege of Rabbah and says, send Uriah to the wall and then everybody withdraw and let Uriah be killed. It's not something that Joab told everybody. So Joab has the goods on David. He knows that David, nobody else knows this, right? Some people might suspect it. It's really strange. It's really kind of curious that suddenly Uriah is dead and David's taking Bathsheba as another wife, and she's pregnant almost instantly. And what happened to Uriah? Doesn't he know better? I mean, there's probably rumors circulating. David's the only one, Joab rather, is the only one who knows for sure. And so Joab has leverage over David. That might give David motivation to just eliminate, kill, assassinate Joab. And eventually he tells Solomon, get rid of Joab, make Joab pay, and Solomon executes Joab. I think the reason why David can't bring himself is probably because of the kin relationship. But Joab maintains a position of power because he holds a secret about the king. Okay. One last thing is, I've talked a bit about this already, but political symbolism. Power is not just a matter of sheer force. Power is a matter of generosity. I've already mentioned that. Power is also a matter of public repute and public appearance. And I have, on your notes, I have 2 Samuel 15, the revolt of Absalom. Absalom begins his revolt by gathering together a bunch of horses and chariots that follow him through the streets of the city. Let me read a little bit. I said I was going to do this briefly. It's not brief, is it? It's tedious. I can't stop myself. It came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. Okay. This is the beginning of a plot to take over the kingdom. He doesn't begin it by attacking David directly. He begins it by creating an impression of importance. You can walk around the streets here around the college. First day I came, Josh and I were taking a walk. We had to stop at the gate of one of the embassies because a couple very large black vehicles were passing by. The guard made us stop on the sidewalk and let these, if you've got an entourage of large black vehicles and limousines, very important person going by. You can create that impression without being a very important person if you've got enough money to hire some big black vehicles and a limousine. You can drive around the city and everybody says, who's that? Must be a very rich and important guy. He's got an entourage. Okay. Absalom is trying to build up his reputation through political symbolism. Okay. And then the next thing he does, he used to rise early and stand on the way to the gate. The gate is the place of judgment, remember. It happened that when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call on him, from what cities are you from? He says, your servant is from one of the tribes of Judah. And Absalom would say, see, your claims are good and right, but nobody listens to you on the part of the king. Absalom would say, oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land, and everyone would have suit would come to me, and I would give him justice. When a man came near to him to prostrate himself before him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. You're not supposed to bow to me. I'm a man of the people. Yeah, I've got 50 runners, but yeah, I'm just a regular guy. Don't bow to me. We're going to face each other. I'm going to kiss you. You can't do that. You can't be that intimate with David, can you? Okay, he's winning the hearts of the people by this political theater. He's winning the hearts by pretending to be an equal with them, while at the same time he's creating this other impression that he's very important. Plus, I think what he's doing with the intercepting people that are coming to the king for judgment, I think what he's doing is screening people. So if somebody says, I'm from one of the towns of Israel, I think that's referring to the tribes other than Judah. I'm from the tribes of Israel. Absalom would say, you try to go into the king's palace. He's from the tribe of Judah. He favors the tribe of Judah. If you're from another tribe, he probably won't listen to you. But I will. So what is the effect of that? If that's what he's doing, he lets the people who are from Judah to go to David. He intercepts the people who aren't from Judah. And the rumor that he's trying to spread actually comes true, because only people who are from Judah get to the king, and all the other people he tries to deal with. So he creates the disparity of, that he's claiming is already there. Okay. So this obviously, Absalom is a rebel, an evil man. He becomes an evil king. This is not a model for political activity, but it does show that there are dimensions to political power beyond just sheer force. Okay, and shrewdness, political shrewdness, requires a sensitivity to those symbolic dimensions and those theatrical dimensions of politics. I mean, this is not news to y'all. In our time, politics is theater, right? What do you know about your political leaders? It's what they're presenting on ads, what you see on the news, which is, how closely controlled by some political powers. You have public events where a ruler or a politician is trying to present himself in a certain way. Okay, it's all political theater. But I think even in the ancient world, that's a component of politics in general, and we need to, I think the books of Samuel, by exposing that, help us to become more shrewd in the way we think about political life. And applying that again, we think about the church. The same kind of power dynamics. How do people gain power in the church? By doing favors, by political theater, by political symbolism. Okay. If you're a devious church leader, you might try to arrange things like Absalom does to make it look like you're the guy who can actually lead, and the other guy is biased. Okay. These things happen in the church too, and Samuel is giving us some insight into the operations of politics that we need to be aware of, both in the church and in the world. Okay.